Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. I recommend you visit SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab. There you will find an ever-growing repository of past programs, but especially the series we are dealing with now, which is unfortunately one of the most important of topics in series. Why do I say unfortunately? Because way back when God's people were in his land, when he was leading them, when he established his covenant relationship with them, they understood his heart. He conveyed his heart. He conveyed what his priorities were to them. That's gotten skewed over the years, and so there has been a shift in perspective and teaching, and it's crept into psychology. It's ubiquitous through psychology as well, that says, in essence, that the survivor, the victim, the person that has been oppressed, is the one that has the responsibility to let things go, regardless of what the hurtful person, the oppressor, the perpetrator has done. We're here to set that straight because not only am I a therapist by profession, but I am someone who is passionate about seeing people set free. And there's no worse way, we could say no better way, than creating someone who will be tied up in emotional knots than to share with someone, to tell them what we have seen in the past here. This is our meme that we are correcting, right? It says, I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology I never received. Okay, that sounds spiritual, but that is, I would say, virtually demonic. Now, before I lose my audience again, go back and watch some past programs, but it sounds so good. I'm going to bring it up again. I never knew how strong I was until I had to forgive someone who wasn't sorry and accept an apology I never received. So, in essence, the guilty party goes free. And that is not what God says. That was never God's heart. God's heart has always been for those that have been on the receiving end of injustice, the receiving end of hurtfulness. And we have looked at a number of weeks, and we are developing what we're going to look at now, or tonight, which is, I believe, the correct biblical perspective when it comes to the issue of injustice. Who has God's heart? Meaning, who God's heart goes out to someone when there has been injustice. And we're going to find out clearly that it is God's heart is for the survivor, for the victim, for the oppressed, never for the oppressor. And so we've looked at in the past this chart or graphic to help us understand on a scale of 1 to 10. This is what we're talking about in terms of negative impact. We looked at when Jesus said to forgive our enemies, right? That can, in English, it sounds like, well, that's anybody. But we looked at it extensively and we did a word study. We found out that the word Jesus used, he could have chosen any three words, two of which have to do with somebody's essence. Those are the top two. Those are wicked enemies, those who are evil versus those that are perpetrating harm. They are categorized as enemies, but they are doing so out of ignorance. God still holds them accountable, but I'm trying to bring my picture, but they're eligible for forgiveness. And I'm going to bring that back up because over on the left, and we looked at that before, Paul said he was eligible for forgiveness. Why? He persecuted out of ignorance and the Roman soldiers. When Jesus said the words that we all read, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. He's hanging on the cross, he's being executed. And the question is, who was he talking about? Well, if any of us were there at the cross that day, I'll tell you who he was talking about. His eyes were looking straight down. How do we know? Because the Roman soldiers were gambling for his clothing, but one was impacted. Whether or not he was converted, we're not exactly sure. But what did the centurion say? Surely this was the Son of God. He got the message. The Roman soldiers on their day off would not have been there. They were fulfilling an obligation as far as that was their job. They were professional executioners. But what about the scribes and Pharisees and high priests? It was Passover, and where were they? They were supposed to be back at work. Where were they? They were running their mouths like in Isaiah 53. They were piling on this man who had done nothing wrong. That is oppression. That is evil. So when Jesus says, forgive your enemies, he's talking about persecutors. Because as we will see in Matthew chapter 5, oftentimes that section of Jesus's first public sermon, his public teaching, it's called the Sermon on the Mount because he went up onto a mountain. He was not on a horse, right? He's up on a mountain. And he will, in my estimation, he is going to first start by talking to two groups of people. We're going to see that, but we're probably going to see it next week because I'm going to set more of the context and give you an additional understanding to know that his heart, God's heart, has never changed. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus had God's heart. He still has God's heart. So Jesus feels exactly the same that God does. God has not changed, and his promise, as we saw in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, the very last words of Moses, as Moses is speaking to the people before he departs and he goes and dies, what does he say? We looked at that. He gave a promise. God, speaking through Moses, gave a promise that said, whenever the children of Israel, whenever God's people were on the receiving end of injustice, of oppression, that God would avenge that. Those are the last words of God through Moses to God's people. That was a promise. The children of Israel held on to that promise. They were to treat people properly, so therefore, ideally, they would not be bringing anything on themselves in terms of having been hurtful, and therefore people are reacting. If we walk on the path of life, we will not be bringing things upon ourselves in terms of being hurtful. What will happen is those that are evil, those that are selfish, will begin to target those that are on the path. Why? Because ultimately those that are on the path will be about the business of helping those who have been negatively impacted. So we've looked at the stages of spiritual growth. A person comes out of the fog and now they start moving onward and upward. They're on the path. So here's our picture that we've looked at before. They're on the path. That's a very individualized path for each of us, but we all are to grow. And so the stages of growth lead upward and onward. And you can see up at the top, the last three levels of growth are going to have to do with the involvement that we will end up when we become salt and light, that we are going to begin to become meaningfully involved in the lives of other people. Jesus said, bear one another's burdens. That has to do with, we've looked at that as a matter of fact, that has to do with in this fallen world, things will come upon us. But oppression is not a burden. Oh, it's burdensome, but oppression is different. So if you didn't even have people in your life, if there were no other people on earth, sometimes that would almost be better than what some people are experiencing, we would still experience burdens. So when we're talking about oppression, we're talking about people who are reacting and responding to people that ultimately are helping other people, are living with integrity, doing the right thing, and are going to be very mindful of other people's needs. And so what happens It's only a matter of time until we come across someone that is in need, but in this case, it's not because of a burden, but it's because of an oppressor. And what did God require of the children of Israel, of his people, when it came to oppression? In Proverbs 24:11-12, God says this: rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to die, save them as they stagger to their death. Now, that could be someone, of course, literally, that we need to be mindful and need to become involved. So we would then appeal on their behalf. But I think it also has to do with, let's say, someone is in a relationship. We've looked at that in the past. If someone is, or if somebody has somebody in their life that is harming, because we've looked at the dogs and the pigs, they need to be away. Somebody needs to be away from the dogs and the pigs. We've looked at that in the past, Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. But once somebody gets away from those, they will find that there's going to be people that are looking to target them, looking to harm them. And it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we are mindful of others' rights, of the rights of other people that are being trampled upon. I will continue. So in Proverbs 24, verses 11-12, God's people understood this was his mandate. As a matter of fact, they would be blessed or cursed depending upon the extent to which they took care of the widow, the orphan, and the alien. The widow, of course, somebody that dies. Now, how did that husband die? It could have been natural causes, so that would be a boulder, or it could be through injustice, so that would be oppression. How about an orphan? An orphan was in a vulnerable position, so they needed help. How did they become an orphan? Could be, again, through natural circumstances, that would be a burden, or somebody killed their parents. So that would be oppression. And then the last category of aliens, those are people that were driven from their home through oppression. It was not a choice on their part to leave. They were driven from their home. They didn't want to have to leave their home. So now their life is destroyed. Their life now, they don't even know what's coming next. And they're wandering. And we looked at Psalm 56:8. It says that God he captures our tears in a bottle. The word for tears in the Hebrew can also mean wanderings. So when you've been negatively impacted in a very significant way by an oppressor, that will change the course of your life, because one of the things we saw about oppressors is they won't stop. They're in the category of psychopaths, quite frankly. These are reprobates. The reprobate mind, they've changed permanently. They've been given over, so they won't stop. They're targeting you. We've looked at the different categories of those, right? We're talking people that not only have negatively impacted you, but then will turn on you and they won't stop. So there's no relief. David was driven into the desert to try to stay away from Saul, but Saul kept after him. So that's the category of oppression. We are called to intervene, and the Jews understood that. Let me continue with the verse. Proverbs 24, verses 11-12. Rescue those who are unjustly sentenced to die, save them as they stagger to their death. Here's God's words. This is very powerful. Don't excuse yourself by saying, well, look, we didn't know. God says, I'm not listening to that. Right? So don't excuse yourself away by saying, well, look, we didn't know. For God understands all hearts and he sees you. He who guards your soul knows you knew, and he will repay all people as their actions deserve. That was 3,000 years ago. His people got that. And in case they didn't get it, here's another one out of the book of Proverbs, chapter 31. So Proverbs chapter 31, most people have heard about the Proverbs 31 woman. Well, I'm here to say we've got a Proverbs 31 guy that comes prior to the Proverbs 31 woman passage. So I'm here to talk about the Proverbs 31 guy. What is he like? First of all, he doesn't get into alcohol. Now, there's a little balance. I personally don't drink, but that's because of the family I came from, and they have nothing but problems. Trust me. Okay. So I chose and have chosen not to drink for a number of reasons. God says it's not for kings to drink. A Nazirite vow John the Baptist, Samson, before he blew it, was a Nazarite. That's different than coming from the city or the town of Nazareth. Jesus was from Nazareth. But a Nazarite vow was the highest vow, that it was the highest level that somebody could step up to really dedicate themselves to God. And so not everybody's going to choose that. And God wanted kings to be very mindful of that. Why? Because their position, they were in a very unique position. As goes the king, so goes the entire nation. Think about what happened with Bill Clinton in the history of the U.S. Once he looked into the camera and said, I did not have sex with that woman.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never.
And I'm tired of, the right-wing conspiracy.
These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
He turned his back on questions as the First Lady followed, applauding.
When that happened, it changed the psyche of this nation. It ate away at the foundation of it. God places a significant degree of responsibility upon rulers and judges. Because if judges make unjust rulings, it will impact people. Why? Because there are innocent parties that are then being harmed twice. It's one thing for the perpetrator to be, or the oppressor to be harming someone, but then if the judge sides on behalf of an unjust person, now injustice will start to go across the land. And if you want to see kids that are wounded, you look at family court where a judge rules improperly, and it will devastate kids for the rest of their life. So in Proverbs 31, verses 8 to 9, here's a Proverbs 31 man. Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves. And the term for themselves also means their rights. So speak up for the rights of those that cannot speak up for themselves. This was not a suggestion. This is a mandate for God's people, that he expects us to be actively involved. You hear the term social justice. That I'm not talking about social justice because that really has its roots in socialism, quite frankly. But God was all about influencing the culture. He was all about ensuring that justice was maintained. David in Psalm 101, right? Think about the basics, biology 101. Read Psalm 101, and at the very last verse, you'll see what David will dedicate himself day in and day out, day and night, to doing. I'll give you a hint. He's going to ferret out injustice all the time. So that ultimately God knows then if I do that, now it doesn't mean that I have to be obsessed. What it means is I need to be mindful. I need to be aware. And if I am aware and God finds out that I have hardened my heart, I'm indifferent, he will take note. So again, starting verse 8 again, Proverbs chapter 1, verses 31, verses 8 and 9. Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves or their rights. Ensure justice for those being crushed. The word crushed also means desolate and defenseless. These are people that have no one to protect them. They've also been probably driven from their home. Verse 9. Yes, speak up for the poor. The word is afflicted. Speak up for the poor. And that's going to be important, that word poor, because in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus references the poor. Speak up for the poor and the afflicted and the helpless or needy, and see that they get justice. So God was and he is very intent upon ensuring that justice prevails. Why? Because he cares passionately about what happens to those that are on the receiving end of injustice. So we looked at last time a chart that, as I will bring mine up here, that gives an understanding, I believe, of what happens when someone becomes unjust. So we've looked at this a couple of different times. This is one way to view when someone gets off the path. They move from left to right, at least in this picture. They move from the good aspect of God's heart, his loving kindness, all the way to as selfishness grows. So again, the question is, what happens if someone has been unjust? How does God feel toward that person versus the person that has been negatively impacted? God's focus is on both, but very differently. He has compassion on the injured party, but look at across the top right. Look at how he feels as people become selfish and move into different categories. And then near the end of the last program, we talked in terms of there are categories in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 22. He talks about the simple. Those are descriptors. I'll read those going straight down. The simple is the same thing as the ignorant, the careless, the naive, here it is, unwary and open to evil. It really means open door. Now, who are they open to? They're also undiscerning and unguarded. They're open to the mocker and the fool. The mocker and the fool will look for people to include in their stuff. They're looking to bad company corrupts what? Good morals. So if a simple person is not going to become wise and move back onto the path, what happens? They themselves will be influenced and their ego will start to grow. So you picture it like getting off the path of life for the straight and narrow, and ego grows like a snowball. And the more my ego grows, the more I am violating my conscience, and eventually I will enter into the realm of what could be called the mocker, what God calls the mocker, but you can see all the different subcategories and look up top, look how God feels about people as they're progressing downward in terms of character development. So the mocker is right on the line, in my estimation, of then morphing into a fool. So we have going straight down, we have the mocker. We're going to bypass fool. He hasn't become a fool quite yet. The scorner, the scoffer, the arrogant despises and rejects the truth. He derides and he ridicules. This is a very active category. This is someone who is a walking middle finger. This is a pig and a dog. These are the people we are not to be around. But if someone doesn't turn it around, what do they become? They become a fool. And that equates to, and in that verse, it says they love evil instead of good. So everything about them changes, their affections, their desires, their perspective, their mind. In what way? Not their IQ, not their brain, not the gray matter and white matter. But so their IQ stays the same, but their disposition changes. In what way does their mind change? They're given over to self. So instead of being able to view people in priorities the way God does, it becomes inverted. They become twisted. So instead of understanding right and wrong, good and bad from God's perspective, it becomes inverted. So instead of loving what is good and hating what is evil, they begin to hate what is good and love what is evil. And it's a visceral thing because their mind is given over, and modern science comes along and we see the mind of a psychopath. And will a psychopath ever change? No, their brain is permanently changed. And the one thing that leaves is the desire to ever be any other way than what they are. They are violating conscience. They get to a point where their conscience is cauterized, it is petrified, it is calloused, and therefore it doesn't work any longer. Therefore, they are crossing boundaries at an ever increasing rate and degree. And the meaning and the implications of what they can do are ever more profound. And they don't care any longer. They lose remorse and they lose empathy. So that is the working definition of psychopathy. So we looked at if someone moves from left to right, this is how the Jews saw them. And the emphasis, again, in terms of who needs to be apologizing, who needs to, where does the responsibility lie? Matthew chapter 5 describes clearly the hurtful person has the onus, has 100% of the responsibility. So if you have been significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted, and again, we're talking at the 8, 9, and 10 level, could also be 7, but the best way to understand the book of Psalms is, again, when you are being significantly impacted, meaning by someone, look at over on the right, white collar psychopaths. Okay, so I call them sadistic emotional terrorists. These people are malevolent, malicious, purposeful, willful, intentional, mission focused, right? They're going to make it their mission in life to make you miserable, calculating, relentless. Saul was relentless. He would not stop. Ruthless, targeted, cruel, and sadistic. These are not mild people. If you don't understand that, then trust me, you've never been on the receiving end of an oppressor. Maybe the question is, you haven't set boundaries. You want to find out if somebody is a white-collar psychopath, you set boundaries with them. If you want to find out if somebody's a pig, a dog, or a fool, or a reprobate, set boundaries with them. Right? Jesus said, he did not come to bring peace, but a sword. Better translated, I didn't necessarily come to bring peace, but a sword. Setting at odds, and then he lists family relationships even. So if everything's going smooth in your life and you have no enemies, now I'm not saying you bring them on yourself. What it probably means is you are not being salt and light, and you're either very fortunate, but it's only a matter of time. Look at what Jesus went through, right? And Jesus said, if they did that to him, they're going to do that to us. So the onus, God places the onus, the responsibility, the focus of his discipline is on the person that is crossing boundaries and then morphing into a bigger and bigger ego-driven individual. So we looked at this picture last time. We're going to briefly look at it before the break. The idea that somebody, there's our little stick figure over in the bottom left. He has his little knapsack. Remember about the knapsack? We are supposed to do what is right, just, and fair, so we are never to give up our knapsack. That comes out of Proverbs chapter 1 and chapter 2. So he ups the fence there. Those are supposed to be little pine trees. Why? Because life is still pretty normal when we first get off the path. Right? God doesn't zap us, so that's why look at the green. So when we first get off the path, he still cares very much about us, but the momentum has started. We are now becoming part of the simple, as it were. Okay. The further someone then goes into selfishness, where's he heading? He's eventually going to head into God's judgment. Why? Because he's becoming increasingly hurtful. So the best way to view that is the person is moving from one category to the next, and not in a good way. So by the time somebody decides that he's going to make the decision when he should or shouldn't turn around, or how hurtful he's been, whether he's going to apologize or not, he is morphing dangerously into very harmful categories, quite frankly. We then looked at an additional, we're going to layer with some additional dynamics. We looked at this near the end. We looked at then at the top. There's a number of things going on. It's not just like karma. Right? We could say, well, this is the law of karma. Let's see if I can, right? That this is very detached, right? So payday someday, if you go too far, then you're going to get what's coming to you because of the law of karma. From a Christian perspective, we don't believe in karma. We believe in what? We believe that somebody at the highest level is keeping score, and he's called the Avenger of Blood. And what happens? He takes note the more selfish we become. So on the top of this chart, and I recommend you increase, take a screenshot and begin to look at this. But he begins to take note of how selfish we become. And as we become selfish, we're becoming more hurtful. And you can see then down under the surface, that selfishness on the very bottom left starts low and it starts to increase and it moves us into the target zone. And then conscience is designed, we're now in the middle left. You see the arrow. Conscience is trying to move us back to the path. And if I have a working conscience, then I have empathy and I also have remorse. So then I added, before we left the program last time, we ended with a greater color version. And what I added then is the overlay of what happens when the prayers of people ascend. And God captures those in a bottle for safekeeping, so that the injured party, Psalm 56:8 says, he captures our tears. Remember, the word tears can be wanderings. He captures our tears in a bottle. So the more someone becomes selfish, the more hurtful they become. And you see the thermometers up there, that God feels angry if we become hurtful. And he, on behalf of another, the person that's being hurt, and that's where along the top, you see the avenger of blood right near the angry eyes. In the dark green, right up on top, it says his loving kindness and his promise. And he is faithful and true. Faithful and true about what? His promise. Promise about what? To avenge blood. Why would he do that? So he can show the injured party how much he cares, that their pain did not fall on deaf ears. Now, in that same chart, we look at then what's going on under the surface of someone that creates an increasing degree of selfishness. There's a very dynamic change, and right in the middle, the person starts to become twisted. So in looking at what's going on under the surface, it's important for us to see that nobody becomes increasingly selfish by accident. And so we're going to look at, when we come back, what happens within someone as they start to become increasingly selfish. What happens, the different layers, different dynamics, and then how does God respond? Why is this vital to understand? Because if you have been on the receiving end of oppression, God's heart is for you. He has captured every tear in a bottle. And it is not up to you to make things okay with the perpetrator, with the oppressor. He will take care of that. He wants you to be still and know that he is God. That's Psalm 46:10, because that is how much he cares. We'll be right back.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by Jon Uhler, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you, in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with Jon Uhler about your situation, or in having Jon conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. My name is Jon Uhler. This is Journey to Healing. We're here every Friday night from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on TECN.TV, the leader in Internet TV. We're in the midst of a series, an in-depth series on the issue of forgiveness. Do you have to forgive everyone regardless? And the simple answer is no, you do not. We've been looking at the reason why. I recommend you go to SurvivorSupport.net under the podcast tab to catch up on what we have been discussing so you have the context to understand what we're going to be sharing, because we're now really getting into the crux of the understanding of who has God's heart. When injustice has been perpetrated, and again, we've looked at what are we talking about when we talk about oppression, injustice? We're talking about oppression. It's at the 8, 9, and 10 level, even the 7, but it's when someone has been meaningfully and significantly negatively affected. So Jesus said, pray for your enemies. Those are the lower level. Those are the persecutors that do things out of ignorance. An enemy who is evil, those are two different words that Jesus did not use. And those are people that are not eligible for forgiveness. Why are they not eligible for forgiveness? Because they won't ask for forgiveness. The onus is on the hurtful person, not the person that does the minor stuff. We're not talking about minor little things. We're talking about the things that God talks about when he talks about oppression and imprecatory prayers, the significant issues. God has always been for those that have been oppressed, for those that have been on the receiving end of hurtfulness. His heart of justice goes out to those people. So how dare any of us give the message to someone who has been significantly and meaningfully negatively impacted that we should just forgive and forget? God doesn't do that. What does God do? He forgives when what? 1 John 1:9. When there's confession. If there is no confession, there is no forgiveness. We are to forgive like God. Does that make us mean, nasty, and unforgiving? No. You're not unforgiving if someone hasn't asked for forgiveness. There's nothing on the table to discuss, and that's the responsibility of the selfish person. So what do we do with that if all of a sudden we tap into, if you've been significantly injured, what do you do with that? That's where imprecatory prayers come in. We started to discuss that. We will continue, but again, look at imprecatory prayers. The nature of an imprecatory prayer is simply this: God, you know what they're doing. Get them. Get them for me. Why? Because God promised to get them. And so we looked at a chart. It's a busy chart, but it's important to see how the Jews understood God's heart, because God revealed himself to his people, and that hasn't changed. Now, whether or not his people, anybody God chooses, are his people, but he has a special place in his heart for the Jews. Why? They are the children of Abraham, and God chose. So, like it or not, they're still his people. Paul talks about that God, for a time, has set aside the Jews as far as he's grafted in the Gentiles. This is very important to understand. But he will then pick back up with his people when he deals with he's been dealing with them. Unfortunately, they've been under judgment, but Isaiah 53 is what they will say when they call upon the name of the Lord, when there's an invasion by the Antichrist, by the way, and all of Israel is going to be under attack. So they will say, Lord, save us now. The Hebrew word is Yeshua. That should ring a bell. That name is Jesus. So when they call upon the name of the Lord, they will be saved, and he will save a portion of Israel. So all Israel then will be saved, because a significant percentage will be wiped out in that invasion. So he has revealed through Scripture how he operates on behalf of the oppressed and how he deals with the oppressor. We looked at in the book of Proverbs how God lays the responsibility upon all of us to be mindful of those who are being treated unjustly. In the book of Isaiah chapter 58, 6 through 12, it says this with regard to fasting, right? The people were fasting and they started to complain that God's not listening. And he says this: I don't want the kind of fasting you're doing. This is the kind of fasting I want. He says, free those who are wrongly imprisoned and lighten the burden of those who work for you. That's important. If you have employees and you are oppressing them, God is paying attention. Then he says this: let the oppressed go free and remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry and give shelter to the homeless. And then verse 9, dropping down, he says, then when you call, the Lord will answer, yes, I'm here. He will quickly reply. But then he goes on to say this, remove the heavy yoke of oppression. Stop pointing your finger and spreading vicious rumors. Those are the same thing, by the way, right? If I'm pointing fingers and spreading vicious rumors, that means I'm slandering. That's a heavy yoke of oppression. So if you find yourself inclined to slander, that word slander in the Greek is diabolos. What is that? That is the word devil. We are no more like Satan than when we speak with forked tongue. God will hold us accountable for what comes out of our mouth. Our words will either build somebody up or tear someone down. In verse 10, it says, he goes on to say, feed the hungry and help those in trouble. There was a mandate that God had. What would happen if nobody assisted? So oppression is happening. Nobody steps in. So let's say that an oppressor is getting worse. We see our little guy up there right in the middle. He's hopped the fence. That red arrow that's starting to become thicker is his selfishness. His selfishness is growing. And look at that green arrow that's pointed up toward the bottle. Those are the sighs and the cries and the prayers of the victims. God is taking note. How do you impact somebody? You do it either through negligence. Look at the N for negligence, starts right at the tip of that arrow, and then look across. You see injustice. And then you see the word personal injury on a scale of 1 to 10, and we have looked at that in the past. God cares about personal injury. And I can do that in a couple different ways. But the more I do it on purpose, the more he's going to take note. Isaiah 59, verses 15 to 18. Let me go back to this chart for a moment. What does God expect of us when it comes to somebody who is being hurt? He expects us to step in and stop the selfish person in one way or another. But what happens if there's nobody to step in? How does God feel about that? Well, he already said that. We read that in the book of Proverbs. He says, don't you dare excuse yourself away. You knew that. So, or we need to be mindful. And then if we turn a blind eye, now it doesn't mean, there's a balance here. But if we know that injustice is taking place, he expects us to get involved. What happens if no one is willing to? You can see then he's going to step in. He's going to step in, and what he says in Isaiah 59 is this. It's very powerful, by the way, is this. Verses 15 to 18, Isaiah chapter 59. Yes, truth is gone, and anyone who renounces evil is attacked. So we could say that's the person that has decided to do the right thing. They're not necessarily activistic in somebody's life. They're doing the right thing. So he says, yes, truth is gone, and anyone who renounces evil is attacked. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what's going on in this day and age. If you speak against the trans deception, if you say that men shouldn't, deviant men dressing in women's underwear and drag should not be invading women's and kids, their private spaces, shouldn't be on women's swim teams, shouldn't be invading women's sports, shouldn't be in rape shelters, shouldn't be sexualizing kids in school, shouldn't be dressing in drag around kids, shouldn't be encouraging kids to transition medically, which is going to sterilize them, then amputate their body parts, right? If you renounce that, you're going to be attacked. And then it continues. The Lord looked. Now, this is what happens when no one is willing to step in. So let's say also somebody does step in, and now they're on the receiving end of injustice. They're going to get fired from their job. They're going to have their professional license attacked. They're going to have their reputation attacked. So we have some moral dilemmas going on at work. Are you going to keep silent, or are you going to step up? At times, how about whistleblowing? Are you going to turn a blind eye, or are you going to step up? God continues. So he says, yes, truth is gone, and anyone who renounces evil is attacked. Here it is. The Lord looked and was displeased to find there was no justice. He's looking for someone to be his hands and feet And if he doesn't find it, verse 16, he was amazed. And the word amazed is astonished and appalled. He's disgusted. He was disgusted to see that no one intervened to help the oppressed. So he himself, what is God going to do? He is driven by his own character. He's driven by justice. He has made a promise to those that are being harmed that he will step in. He's the avenger of blood. He is the protector. He has made a promise. So when no one was there to step in, he has to do it himself. He's not pleased with that. That's the mandate for us. So he himself stepped in to save them with his strong arm, and his justice sustained him. Now, this will sound like Ephesians chapter 6, if anybody's familiar with this. So he put on righteousness as his body armor and placed the helmet of salvation on his head. That means if I have spiritual armor on, the gates of hell will not prevail against me. I am to be active as salt and light. He clothed himself with a robe of vengeance and wrapped himself in a cloak of divine passion. Do I have the same passion that God has? Am I moved with God's heart? Am I moved by his heart? So he clothed himself with a robe of vengeance, wrapped himself in a cloak of divine passion. He will repay his enemies for their evil deeds. Well, they didn't do it to him. Insomuch as you've done it to the least of these, my brethren, you've done it to who? Or insofar as you didn't, meaning give a cup of cold water in his name. He will repay his enemies. So his enemies are the enemies. His enemies are those that are not just persecuted, those that are oppressing. If you oppress someone, you become an enemy of God, and he will step in. He sees the heart. He will repay his enemies for their evil deeds. His fury will fall on his foes, and he will pay them back even to the ends of the earth. Why? So that those that have been harmed can see that he loves them that much. His loving kindness will be displayed by going after those that are perpetrating injustice. It is sickening to him if we do not intervene. If you sit back and you think your job as a Christian is retirement, it is not. There's no such thing as retirement for a Christian. We need to be salt and light. He goes on, almost an identical passage. That was Isaiah 59. Again, why am I reading this? To help us understand, don't ever tell a survivor or an oppressor that they need to just get over it. God doesn't say that. Do not tell a sexual abuse victim, you know what, happened in the past, let bygones be bygones. God doesn't say that. What does God say? He says, hang tight. I will take care of this for you so that you can see it. If you have harmed someone significantly, the God of heaven's armies has drawn a bead on you. That's Matthew chapter 5. If you suddenly remember you've been significantly hurtful to someone, you've been brain dead up to this point, but now your conscience is coming back alive, that's God's gift to you. You better get up and go make it right. Why? Because the person is on the way to who? The person is on the way to the judge. Now that's a word picture, but what's on the way to the judge? The sighs and the cries and the tears and the pain. God knows. So Isaiah 63, see if this doesn't sound identical. So 4 chapters later, God says this. Who is this that comes from Edom, from the city of Basra, with his clothes stained red? So somebody's got a lot of blood on him. Who is this in royal robes marching in great strength? It is I, the Lord, announcing your salvation to those who have been harmed. It is I, the Lord, who has the power to save. God is a saving God, not just in terms of salvation, but stopping injustice. That person says, why are your clothes so red? As if you've been treading out grapes. Notice the phrase, grapes of wrath. Okay. He responds, I've been treading out the winepress alone. No one was there to help me. No one was with me. That's not a good thing, by the way. We want to be God's hands and feet. If you heard about or seen the movie, sorry I get touched, The Sound of Freedom, Tim Ballard is God's hands and feet. Jim Caviezel is God's hands and feet. What are we doing to help? What are we doing to help rescue kids? What are we doing to help stop evil? In this day and age, we have to be doing whatever we can. If you can't do much, you can probably help support someone some way, to give them the ability to set them free to get in the game. So, think about an Indy 500 race car driver. He could not be in the race if it weren't for what? His pit crew. So, not everybody is tasked with being the one to storm the gates, but you can supply the bullets, right? So, it really is a team effort, but we each have a part to play. So, God says again, I've been treading the winepress alone. No one was there to help me. In my anger, I've trampled my enemies as if they were grapes. In my fury, I've trampled my foes. Who's his foes? Those that are hurting people. Their blood has stained my clothes. It ain't pretty what God's going to do to people, perpetrators. For the time has come, and every survivor needs to hear this. Just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Okay, God's timing is amazing. So I want you to take heart. Those of you that have been on the receiving end of injustice, just know that the perpetrators have not gotten away with it. God is still very active. So God says in verse 4, for the time has come, for the day of vengeance was in my heart, for me to avenge my people. Really, God is always having to restrain himself. He has reasons why he's restraining, but he always feels it, to ransom them from their oppressors. Here's the same wording. I was appalled. I was amazed, meaning I was aghast to see that no one intervened to help the oppressed. And it's very interesting that in that verse, I was amazed or appalled to see that there was no one for me to uphold to help the oppressed. So that also could mean God will uphold us, those of us that are that hear the call, that are answering that call to intervene, that God will uphold us. Why? Because we will be on the receiving end of those that are oppressing the people. We begin to step in and intervene. So God says this, he was appalled. So I myself, God himself, stepped in to save them with his strong arm, and my wrath sustained me. I crushed the nations in my anger and made them stagger and fall to the ground, spilling their blood upon the earth. And now the person that was rescued says this, I will tell of the Lord's unfailing love. I will praise the Lord for all he has done. I will rejoice in his great goodness to Israel, which he has granted according to his loving mercy. God's greatest gift that he gives to those that have been harmed is the knowledge of his intensity, that people do not get away with evil. So what happens is, as someone is getting worse, so I'll show two charts very quickly. This is on the inside of someone, the yellow. We'll go into this in detail, but as someone is becoming worse, and this comes out of or from the chart that we saw in the last week and a little bit this time. Okay, look at what's happening in the heavens in terms of character. Heavens are on the top, and that's behavior. And then look what's happening underneath. When somebody gets worse, they go from the Niagara River to Niagara Falls in terms of the pull of ego is sending them toward very dark things. I mean, they're hardening their heart. It becomes worse. And as they become worse, they become twisted and they become more hurtful. So the yellow is what's happening to the selfish person's character, and the pink are the cries and the prayers, the victim's prayers and tears and pain and injury. And the injustice they've suffered is heading where? It is heading up to the heavens. God pays attention and he wants people to know. And then look at also, it matches the color. So when someone has been hurtful, has become increasingly hurtful, They need to understand it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of an angry God. You will be turned over for justice. So I recommend to the hurtful person, you had better turn around. And to those that have been hurt, to those that have cried themselves to sleep night after night, wanting just peace, but the oppressor and the perpetrator continues, know that God cares. He collects your tears in a bottle. Not one tear has fallen on deaf ears. And on your behalf, look at to the right of that bottle. That is his heart. Take a screenshot of this. Look at those verses. We will look at some of those. But on behalf of his heart toward the injured person, toward the oppressed, God will take up your cause so that you don't have to. So therefore, what God says to the person that has been hurt by the oppressor, he doesn't say, you know what, get over it, forgive and forget. He doesn't say that. What does he say? He says, be still and know that I'm God. He has a passionate heart for you. If you have been harmed, if you've been the victim of sexual abuse, if you've had a loved one that's been murdered, if you've had someone who ruined your life and you acted with integrity and they targeted you because you set boundaries, the God of the universe has you in mind when he says that I will repay. He knows and he cares. We will continue looking at what is God's heart toward the survivor, what is God's heart toward the perpetrator, and we will look more in depth at how does God move on behalf of those who have been harmed. We will look at that next time here on Journey to Healing.
You've been listening to Journey to Healing, sponsored by SurvivorSupport.net. We trust you've been helped by the information our host, Jon Uhler, has shared. To donate to this ministry, schedule a personal consultation with Jon, or to arrange a professional training for your church or organization with Jon, simply visit our website. On behalf of Survivor Support, we look forward to hearing from you and to have you join us next time on Journey to Healing.